My parents left for UK with my brother after my crash. Don't call us while we're in Rome. My name is Megan White and I am 20 years old. The pain in my ribs was sharp, rhythmic, and unforgiving, a cruel reminder with every breath that I had survived something I wasn't supposed to. The sterile smell of the hospital mixed with the faint scent of blood and antiseptic, a cocktail I would grow all too familiar with in the coming weeks. I blinked against the blinding white ceiling, my vision swimming, ears ringing, and body heavy with the dull weight of trauma. I didn't remember much about the crash itself, just flashes. The sound of screeching tires. A horn. The brief, irrational thought that I would be late for my marketing presentation. Then blackness. But what came after, the aftermath, the silence, the decisions that were made in rooms I wasn't present in, those I remember with agonizing clarity. I'd always thought if anything terrible happened to me, my family would rally around me. That they would show up. I was wrong. Very wrong. My name is Megan White. I was 29 years old when the accident happened, and for the first time in my life, I realized I had made a dangerous assumption, that love equaled loyalty. That family meant showing up when things fell apart. That someone, anyone, would hold my hand when the world around me shattered. But that hand never came. Not from my parents. Not from my brother. Not even a text asking if I was okay. Instead, while I lay in a hospital bed with a fractured pelvis, 2 broken ribs, and a concussion that left me dizzy for weeks, they were boarding a plane to UK. My mother left me a voicemail, just one, saying they had been planning the trip for months, that the tickets were non-refundable, and that she needed the break. She said it in a bright tone, as if she were talking about brunch plans. Then she ended the message with words that etched themselves into my soul like acid, "Don't call us while we're in Rome." At first, I thought I was hallucinating. The pain medication was strong and made time bend in strange directions. But when I checked my phone again, 20 missed calls from coworkers, 2 from my neighbor, 0 from my family, I knew it wasn't the meds. They had left. They were gone. I was alone. The days that followed were slow, mechanical, and lonely in a way I didn't know a person could feel. My friend Sasha came by once or twice to drop off some books and toiletries. My boss sent flowers. A nurse named Carol talked to me more than anyone else, her gentle voice the only kindness I encountered for hours at a time. I wanted to ask her to just sit with me longer, but I hated feeling needy. My father always said I was dramatic. That I liked attention. I could almost hear his voice in my head even as I tried to silence it. I had always known that my brother Jake was the favorite. He was charming, effortlessly funny, and brilliant in a chaotic kind of way. The kind of guy who failed algebra but aced every creative writing class without trying. When he dropped out of college and started traveling to find himself, my parents supported it like he was some misunderstood genius. They funded his backpacking through South America, cheered when he launched a YouTube channel that got 3 subscribers, and gushed to anyone who would listen about his potential. I, on the other hand, got a scholarship, graduated early, and started working in tech sales. They called me practical. Not a compliment. They said I didn't take enough risks, didn't live. And now, while I lay immobile with a catheter and 4 lines, my parents were sipping espresso at a cafe near the Trevi Fountain, taking selfies with Jake and posting captions like "La Dolce Vita with the fam." I saw it all on Instagram. I saw the comments, too. "Your son is gorgeous. You guys look like the happiest family." They were. Just not with me in it. When I was discharged, I returned to an empty apartment. My plants were dead, the fridge smelled like spoiled yogurt, and a letter from the insurance company had been slipped under the door, partial liability. Which meant partial payment. Which meant I was broke. I had always been careful with money, but physical therapy and hospital bills don't care about your budgeting skills. My job was on hold indefinitely. I couldn't walk without crutches. I couldn't drive. And I couldn't even shower properly without leaning against the wall like a wounded animal. I called my mom once. She didn't pick up. Instead, I got a text the next morning: "Rome is incredible. You'd love the markets. We're heading to Venice next. How are you feeling?" As if I had just come down with a cold. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I felt something inside me fracture, not a bone, something deeper. Something you don't see on X-rays. It was the trust. The belief that no matter how distant or complicated a family might be, they wouldn't leave you behind when your life had been turned upside down. That belief was dead now. I stopped checking their photos. I muted their messages. I focused instead on surviving. Shower chairs, microwave dinners, telehealth check-ins. I taught myself how to cook with one hand. I moved my mattress to the living room because it was closer to the bathroom. Every task was a small mountain. I climbed it alone. 3 weeks later, my mom called. This time I answered, mostly out of curiosity. She was back in the States and breathless with excitement. She wanted to tell me about the gondola ride. About the pasta making class. About how Jake had met someone special in Naples. She didn't ask how I was until the end of the call, and even then, it was tossed in like an afterthought, like asking if it had rained recently. I told her the truth. That I was recovering. That I was scared. That I had missed them. She said, "Well, sweetie, you're strong. You'll bounce back." Then she added, "Besides, we didn't want to ruin the trip with bad news." I didn't cry during the call. I waited until it ended. Then I cried for an hour. Not because I was physically hurting. But because I finally understood the truth: some people will choose joy over loyalty every single time, even if it means abandoning someone they claim to love. Over the next few months, I got better physically. The limp faded. The bruises healed. The bills piled up, but I paid what I could. I picked up freelance work. I built a routine. I relearned how to trust my body. But emotionally, I was unmoored. I started therapy. I journaled. I replayed the crash over and over in my mind, not because I wanted to, but because I needed it to make sense. It never did. The therapist told me trauma doesn't always come from the event, it can come from what happens after. I believed her. Jake eventually called too. He said he wanted to visit. That he had something to tell me. When he arrived, I expected guilt. An apology, maybe. But what I got was another blow. He didn't come to check on me. He came to announce that he was moving to Europe permanently. That our parents were going to help fund a small art gallery he wanted to open in Florence. My parents, who hadn't offered a single cent for my therapy or recovery, were now investing in Jake's dream of selling watercolor paintings to tourists. He beamed when he said it, like it was the happiest news in the world. And I realized then that this wasn't just about a bad decision. It was a pattern. One I had refused to see for years. Jake was the chosen one. And I was the spare. I thanked him for telling me. I smiled when he hugged me goodbye. Then I locked the door and sat in the silence, letting the truth settle into my bones like winter. I was never going to be enough for them, not unless I stopped being me. And I was done trying to be anyone else. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that something was coming. Something that would flip everything upside down again. Not a crash this time. But a choice. A betrayal. And I wouldn't be the one making it. They would. And when they did, it would reveal just how deep the favoritism went, and just how far I was willing to go to protect myself, even if it meant walking away for good. It had been 6 months since the accident, and by then, the numbness had faded into something sharper. Not rage. Not quite. It was a kind of clarity that stung like alcohol in a wound. I no longer expected calls from my parents. I no longer pretended they might show up at my door with groceries or homemade soup or even an apology. The silence between us had calcified into routine. My days became disciplined, structured. I got up early, went to physical therapy 3 times a week, and picked up enough remote marketing contracts to keep the lights on. But something inside me had shifted. Permanently. I wasn't mourning the loss of my family, I was quietly packing up their space in my life, folding them away like out-of-season clothes. Then the letter came. It wasn't from my parents. It wasn't even addressed in handwriting I recognized. It was printed on thick cream paper, folded neatly into thirds. The envelope had an Italian postmark. Inside was a formal invitation to Jake's gallery opening in Florence. An invitation sent to me. You are cordially invited to the debut showcase of Studio Bianco, featuring the works of emerging artist Jake White. At first, I thought it was a joke. But the embossed logo and the RSVP email made it clear, they wanted me there. Or at least, Jake did. I stared at the letter for a long time, trying to decipher the message beneath the politeness. Was this an olive branch? Or just a publicity stunt? A way to say, look how far we've come, without acknowledging what they've done? 2 days later, the real twist arrived. An email. Subject line. We need your help. It was from my mother. She didn't waste time with small talk. She went straight into it. Jake had been in a minor accident, just a scooter slip, but had broken his wrist. The gallery opening was still happening, but he wouldn't be able to set everything up on his own. Could I come early and support my brother during this crucial moment? She included flight details. A paid ticket. A hotel booking. Everything prearranged. All I had to do was say yes. For a moment, I considered deleting it. I hovered over the trash icon, my finger twitching. But something stopped me. Not kindness. Not nostalgia. Strategy. Because beneath my exhaustion and my disappointment, something else had started to bloom. A kind of quiet, meticulous resolve. They had abandoned me when I was broken. Now they needed me when their golden child was. I wasn't going to say no. But I wasn't going to say yes either. Not until I was sure what they really wanted from me. So I called the number listed in the email, expecting some assistant or booking agent. But it was my dad who picked up. His voice caught me off guard. He sounded older. Not just in years, exhausted in a way I hadn't heard before. He greeted me like we'd spoken yesterday, like nothing had ever gone wrong, like Rome and Venice and silence had never happened. I kept my tone flat. I asked questions. What exactly did they want me to do? Why hadn't they contacted Jake's friends in Florence? Why me? His answers were vague. Rambling. Until he slipped and said something that made my blood go cold. It's not just the wrist, Meg. He's not himself. He's been confused. Angry. We're worried. That changed everything. I agreed to fly out, but only on my terms. I booked a different flight. I arranged my own hotel. I didn't tell them when I was landing. I needed to see for myself what was really going on, and I needed to do it without being trapped in their itinerary. Florence was warm and golden when I arrived, the kind of city that seduces you with sunlight and cobblestones and wine. But I wasn't there to be seduced. I took a taxi straight to the gallery. It was smaller than I expected, tucked into a side street near a fountain where teenagers fed pigeons. The sign wasn't even up yet. Inside, I found Jake. And I barely recognized him. His wrist was in a cast, but that wasn't the problem. His face was pale and drawn, eyes bloodshot, hair disheveled. His movements were jittery, distracted. He didn't see me at first, too busy arguing with a man who looked like a contractor. When he did turn, his expression shifted in rapid succession, confusion, surprise, something like guilt, then a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He hugged me. Briefly. Tense. We sat in the back room, the kind meant for private viewings or wine tastings. He told me everything was fine. That he just needed help mounting a few canvases and setting up lighting. But I saw it in the way his hand trembled, in the way he avoided eye contact. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I offered to help. He nodded too quickly. Over the next 48 hours, the truth began to leak out. Jake hadn't just fallen off a scooter. He had crashed one, intoxicated, after a night out with someone he barely remembered. He had been spiraling for weeks. Drinking heavily. Missing meetings. Screaming at the gallery manager. The opening had almost been cancelled. My parents had flown out in a panic, but once they got here, they realized they couldn't control him. So they called me. Not because they trusted me. Because I was their last resort. But there was something else. Something bigger. Jake wasn't just drinking. He had been gambling. Online. In person. Secretly. Recklessly. He owed money. A lot of it. And not just to institutions, but to people. People who had started showing up. At his apartment. At the gallery. One of them had even cornered my dad outside a cafe, demanding payment. My dad looked hollow when he told me that part, like the reality of what Jake had become had finally cracked through the shell of denial. And then my mother said it. "We need you to loan us the money." I stared at her, disbelief flooding through me. She said it as if it were obvious, natural, inevitable. Like of course the daughter they abandoned should now rescue them from the mess their favorite had made. I didn't answer. Not immediately. Instead, I asked for numbers. Names. Details. They hesitated. But I insisted. And that's when I learned the truth. They had already taken out a second mortgage on their house. They had already drained their retirement fund. They were broke. And Jake's debt was still growing. I went back to my hotel and didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, trying to understand how we had ended up here. Me, the cast-off, being asked to fix everything. Jake, the golden boy, unraveling in slow motion. My parents, finally confronting the consequences of years of enabling wrapped in praise. And in that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to save them. But I was going to expose the truth. The next day, I arrived at the gallery early. I asked Jake if I could record some behind-the-scenes content for social media. He agreed, distracted and manic. I filmed everything, him barking orders, pacing, trying to cover the cast on his wrist. Then I asked if I could interview him, just for personal archive. He talked. Rambling, erratic, slipping in details I didn't even prompt. About the accident. The investors. The lost money. The guilt. It all came spilling out. That night, I edited the footage into a 6-minute clip and sent it to my parents. I told them they had 24 hours to tell the truth, to their friends, to the gallery partners, to the public, or I would. I didn't do it to be cruel. I did it because they were all still pretending. Pretending this was a glitch. A bump. A bad week. It wasn't. This was who Jake had become. And who they had enabled him to be. At first, they were furious. Then desperate. Then finally, resigned. The next day, they cancelled the opening. The gallery would remain, but the event was postponed indefinitely. A public statement was made about Jake taking time to heal and recover, vague enough to save face but honest enough to stop the bleeding. They flew home a week later, silent and broken. Jake stayed behind. And so did I. Not for long, but long enough to reclaim something. I walked the streets of Florence alone. I ate pasta at tiny cafes and sketched in a notebook I hadn't opened in years. I remembered that I once had dreams that had nothing to do with being useful to anyone. That I once had a life that didn't orbit their approval. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Jake's troubles weren't over. And the next time the phone rang, it wouldn't be a plea. It would be a warning. I had been back in the States for exactly 10 days when the call came. Not from my parents. Not from Jake. From a blocked number. I let it ring once. Twice. A third time. Something in me whispered answer it. So I did. The voice on the other end was cold. Male. And it didn't introduce itself. It only asked one question, "Are you the sister?" I didn't say yes, but I didn't hang up either. The voice continued. He owes more than he told you. A lot more. And if he skips, it's not him who'll pay. Then the line went dead. I stood there in my kitchen, hand still holding the phone, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly louder than it should have been. It was the kind of moment that shouldn't have felt real. Like a scene from a movie, some cliché plot twist. But there it was, in my reality. And just like that, the lines between anger, guilt, and fear blurred again. Because if this was the kind of debt where strangers with unknown numbers made threats, it wasn't just a matter of unpaid cards and missed rent. Jake had crossed into something else. Something darker. And my name, my connection, was now in their sights. I called my mother immediately. She didn't pick up. I tried again. Nothing. When she finally called back hours later, her tone was casual, brittle around the edges. I told her what had happened. Her response was quiet. It's just scare tactics. People like that want to rattle you so you'll pay. I asked if she knew how much he really owed. She sighed, then said a number so large I had to ask her to repeat it. $56,000. And that was only what they knew about. It had started with sports betting. Moved into cryptocurrency trading with borrowed funds. Then escalated into high-stakes poker tournaments in Florence and Nice. Some games weren't exactly sanctioned. Some players weren't exactly professionals. She said all this like she was reading from a script she'd memorized but didn't believe. When I asked if Jake was still in UK, her voice cracked. He left Florence. He's somewhere in Croatia. He says he's safe. My father added from the background, he says a lot of things. I knew then that this wasn't going to end quietly. Jake had run. Again. And they were still covering for him. Still funding it, still defending him. But the difference this time was that his mess was bleeding into my life. My safety. My job. My name. 2 days later, it bled further. I came home from the pharmacy to find my front door unlocked. I never forgot to lock it. Ever. Inside, nothing was missing. Nothing stolen. But someone had been there. I could feel it. A drawer slightly open. My laptop moved an inch off center. A coffee mug that had been in the sink now spotless and dry. It was subtle. But deliberate. A message. I called the police. Filed a report. They were polite, took notes, asked if I had any enemies. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain that your brother's secret gambling debts might be seeping into your quiet, rented life in a city thousands of miles from where the mess started? I changed the locks the next day. I installed a camera. I didn't sleep for 3 nights. Then I got an email. From Jake. It was long. Frantic. Filled with typos. He said he was sorry. That things had spiraled. That he had met people he shouldn't have, and now he didn't know how to get out. He begged me not to tell Mom and Dad. Said he didn't want them dragged into the next part. That phrase stuck with me, the next part. What did that mean? He didn't explain. But at the bottom of the email, in barely readable font, was a line that chilled me more than the voicemail had. If anything happens, go to the yellow box. I read it 10 times. The yellow box? Then I remembered. An old art supply box Jake had once kept in our parents' garage. When we were teenagers, he'd store his sketches and tiny sculptures in it. I hadn't thought about it in years. But if it was still there. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house without telling them. They were surprised to see me. My mom looked tired, makeup half applied. My dad was in a robe. I told them I needed to grab something old of mine from the garage. They didn't argue. I found the box exactly where I remembered. Tucked behind a stack of plastic bins labeled Christmas and old coats. It looked harmless. Faded yellow plastic, a cracked lid, stickers peeling off. I opened it expecting nostalgia. Instead, I found a storm. Inside were envelopes. Dozens of them. Receipts. Loan contracts. Names. Phone numbers scribbled in panic. IOUs. Cash transfers. Even a passport that wasn't his, with a different name but his photo glued inside. I stared at it, trying to make it make sense. There were also 3 printed emails, each one more desperate than the last, talking about payments, threats, someone named Vasco, and phrases like last warning and interest recalculated. It was a map of a life unraveling. I didn't tell my parents what I found. Instead, I took the box, locked it in my trunk, and drove straight to a lawyer. I needed to know what this meant. What my liability was. If my name was attached to any of it. The lawyer, an older woman named Evelyn, was calm but serious. She read through the documents with surgical attention. Then she looked at me and asked the question I had avoided asking myself, do you want to protect him or protect yourself? I didn't answer right away. Because I wasn't sure. Jake had been many things to me over the years. A brother. A shadow. A burden. A charm bomb that exploded wherever he went. But he had also been the kid who shared ice cream with me on bad school days, who taught me how to sneak out the window, who defended me once in front of bullies. That version of him, the one from before the spiral, still flickered in my mind. But I knew the answer. I want to protect myself. She nodded. We started paperwork immediately. To ensure my financial records were isolated. To legally distance my accounts from any family ties. To prepare restraining orders if needed. And then she suggested something else. Something I hadn't considered. Report him. I froze. She continued. If you have evidence, and you do, it may be safer in the long run to report him to authorities. If this escalates and you're found to have known but done nothing, it could implicate you. Especially if someone gets hurt. That was the moment the scale tipped. Jake wasn't just spiraling. He was in free fall. And he was willing to take anyone down with him, including me. I spent the weekend thinking. Reading the letters again. Staring at the fake passport. Weighing guilt against logic. Love against safety. And by Sunday night, I made the call. I reported him. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. The detective I spoke to took everything seriously. He asked for copies, photos, a full statement. I gave it all. And once I hung up, the silence in my apartment felt different. It wasn't dread anymore. It was relief. Bitter, complicated, but real. What I didn't know was that this action, this one call, would ripple faster than I expected. 3 days later, Jake was arrested at a ferry terminal in Dubrovnik. He was trying to board under the fake passport. The news made headlines in certain circles. American artist detained in Europe for fraud investigation. My parents called, hysterical. Accused me of betrayal. Of destroying the family. My mother cried so hard I thought she might stop breathing. My father simply hung up. And I stayed quiet. Because they didn't know the full extent of what I had saved them from. They didn't know that I had received a second call. One I hadn't told them about. A voice from the first man again. This time, he said, we know who's talking. Stay quiet if you want to stay safe. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Because I had learned something in the quiet aftermath of abandonment, betrayal, and chaos. I had learned how to survive. Even if it meant burning bridges I once built with both hands. The first night after Jake's arrest was silent, but not in a peaceful way. It was a kind of silence that presses against your chest, that whispers, "This isn't over." I lay in bed watching the light change on the ceiling, waiting for the guilt to arrive, but it didn't. Or maybe it did, but it had changed shape. It no longer looked like betrayal. It looked like self-preservation. It looked like finally standing up. By morning, the story had reached American media. Jake's face was on the homepage of several art and travel blogs. The headlines were dramatic, even exaggerated: prodigal son or con man? Rising artist caught in international scheme. The comments were cruel. The photos were worse. I saw a mugshot, eyes red, hair a mess, the expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. I didn't save the photo, but I couldn't stop seeing it. My parents didn't call again. But others did. A journalist reached out, offering me a chance to set the record straight. I declined. Then someone from an art collective messaged me saying they'd known Jake briefly in Florence, that they weren't surprised. The weirdest call came from someone claiming to be a lawyer representing interests in Serbia, asking vague questions about the yellow box and any other assets Jake might have left behind. I hung up. That afternoon, Evelyn, the attorney I'd hired, called with updates. Jake's extradition was in progress. Croatia was cooperating. The case was shifting from local fraud to international financial crimes. He could be facing prison time. Real time. She paused before asking me, "Do you want to submit a victim statement?" "You have the right to." I didn't know. Was I a victim? I hadn't lost money. I hadn't been physically harmed. But then I thought about the crash, about the voicemail, about the unlocked door, the threats, the way my life had twisted into a shape I didn't recognize, all because I shared DNA with someone who thought charisma was a currency. So I said yes. Writing the statement took me 3 nights. I didn't write it for vengeance. I wrote it so I could tell the truth, maybe for the first time without apology. I detailed everything: his lies, his manipulation, how our parents covered for him again and again. How I had paid in other ways: my sleep, my peace, my career delays, my health. I ended it with a sentence I had to rewrite 6 times before I finally left it alone: "I am not angry that my brother broke the law, I am angry that everyone expected me to absorb the damage." I emailed the statement and closed my laptop. I expected to feel lighter, but I didn't. Not yet. The next week was a blur of silence. Jake had a hearing scheduled in Dubrovnik. I didn't attend, but a reporter emailed me a summary. He had a public defender. He didn't deny most of the charges. But he described himself as a man who'd lost control. That phrase stuck with me. It was true. But it was also convenient. Then came the twist I hadn't seen coming. I was walking to the corner store when I saw a familiar figure standing outside my building. It was my father. He looked thinner, older, his shoulders slouched in a way I didn't remember. He didn't say anything right away. Just nodded as if waiting for permission to speak. I didn't invite him in. We sat on the stoop. It was awkward. The last time we'd spoken, he'd hung up on me. He started slow. Said they had spoken to Jake on a supervised call. That he was scared. That he kept asking for me. "He thinks you saved his life," my father said quietly. I said nothing. He continued, "Your mother's not well. She's been having episodes. Anxiety attacks, maybe worse." I turned to look at him then, startled. "She's been crying in the middle of the night, mumbling things that don't make sense. She keeps asking if this is her fault." I didn't know what to say. I felt something loosen in my chest, but I wasn't sure if it was compassion or fatigue. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. It was thick. I recognized my mother's handwriting on the outside. "She wrote you something. Said you probably wouldn't read it, but she had to try." He didn't hand it to me. Just set it between us on the concrete. Then he added, "I don't know if we can ever fix what's broken. But I wanted you to know, we're trying." Then he left. I stared at the envelope for a long time. I didn't open it. Not right away. I spent the rest of the day cleaning. Scrubbing surfaces that didn't need it. Rearranging books. Trying to push the weight of it out of my mind. But by nightfall, the letter was still on my counter, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I opened it. It wasn't long. Just 2 pages. But it was unlike anything I'd ever read from my mother. She started by admitting it. All of it. That she had always excused Jake. That she'd seen his unraveling but called it eccentricity. That she'd left me in that hospital bed because it was easier than facing the truth of who they had failed. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't even ask for it. She just said, if I had to do it over, I would choose you first. I cried then. Quiet, stunned tears. Not because I forgave her. But because after all this time I finally felt seen. The next few weeks passed in strange rhythms. Jake's case advanced. My therapist and I unpacked everything, my role as the strong one, the guilt I had carried like a second spine, the way I had been taught that being useful was the only way to be loved. I took more freelance work. Went hiking again. I started sleeping through the night. And then, another twist. One morning, I received an email from an Italian journalist who had read my statement. She asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed, not about Jake's crimes, but about surviving the fallout of someone else's collapse. At first, I declined. But something inside me whispered. Maybe it's time to speak. Not for Jake. Not even for my parents. But for me. The interview was small, buried in a lifestyle column, but it made waves in certain circles. People started messaging me. Strangers. Women. Siblings. People who'd been the responsible one in their families. People who'd been asked to clean up messes they didn't make. I felt less alone than I ever had. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Claire in Minnesota. She wrote, "Thank you for saying it's okay to walk away before you collapse too. That saved me more than you'll ever know." That night, I walked to my window and looked out at the city lights. For the first time in nearly a year, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I still hadn't seen Jake. Not since the gallery. But a letter came for me the following week. A real letter. From jail. It was from him. The envelope was plain. The writing familiar. I held it in my hands for a long time before I opened it. The letter from Jake was folded in quarters and smelled faintly of pencil and prison ink. I unfolded it slowly, expecting rage, or manipulation, or some last-ditch plea for money. What I got was silence at first, rows of blank space between short sentences, like he didn't know how to begin or end, only how to confess in pieces. He said he remembered the crash. Not mine, his. The first real one, years ago, when he totaled my dad's truck and came home with a sprained wrist and a lie about hitting a deer. He said that night should have been his wake-up call, but instead, it became his blueprint. He described the thrill of getting away with it. How Mom cleaned up the mess and Dad told the insurance company something about icy roads. How I stayed quiet, even though I knew the truth. "You were always the one who saw me," he wrote. "And the only one who ever scared me because of that." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't defend his choices. But he said something I hadn't expected. "I wanted to crash your life too. Not because I hated you, but because I hated that you kept building while I kept burning. It was easier to drag you into the fire than face the fact that you'd made it out." I sat with that sentence for a long time. He ended the letter by saying he was agreeing to a plea deal. That he'd be in a medium security prison for a while. That part of him was relieved. He called it his reset button. Then he added, "If you ever want to write back, you can. But if you never do, I understand. I finally understand a lot of things." I didn't know whether to cry or feel vindicated. So I did both. I cried for the boy he'd been, For the one who shared a bunk bed with me when we were kids, who drew monsters on the wall and said they'd protect us while we slept. I cried for the version of me who once believed that if I just gave enough time, energy, silence, I could hold everyone together. But I also felt vindicated because I had survived it. I had survived them. A week later, I mailed a letter. It wasn't long. I didn't say much. Just that I had read his words. That I hoped he meant them. That I was healing. I didn't sign it love. Just my name. That could have been the ending. The moment the storm passed and I rebuilt. But life has a way of offering one last gust of wind after the skies start to clear. 3 months after Jake's sentencing, my mom had what the doctors called a stress-related cardiac event. Not a heart attack, exactly, but serious. She was rushed to the hospital. My dad called me from the parking lot, voice shaking. I hadn't heard him cry in years. He said he didn't know who else to call. That mom kept mumbling about me, how she needed to fix it. I drove there. I didn't think. I didn't argue with myself about whether it was healthy or not. I just went. The sight of her in that hospital bed made something in me unravel. She looked small. Not weak exactly, just worn. The kind of worn that comes from years of holding in too much. She opened her eyes and whispered my name. Then she started crying, not in the loud, dramatic way she used to when things didn't go her way, but like someone who was finally letting go. She said she was sorry. Again and again. Not just for UK. For all of it. For leaving me alone. For expecting me to fix everyone. For loving Jake louder. I didn't say, it's okay, because it wasn't. But I said, I hear you. And somehow, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, we spoke more. Not perfectly. Sometimes it was awkward. Sometimes she tried to slip into her old tone, and I had to gently stop her. But it was different now. Because I had changed. I didn't go back to being the fixer. I didn't take on her guilt like I used to. But I allowed space for healing. For both of us. My dad softened too. We started having coffee once a week. He told me stories I'd never heard, about his father's silence, his own struggle to express anything that wasn't practical. He said he never realized how much I carried. That when Jake faltered, it felt easier to pretend he'd bounce back than to admit they'd raised a storm. At one of our coffee meetings, he handed me a check. A large one. He said it was part of the money they had planned to put into Jake's gallery. That they wanted to give it to me instead, not to fix things, not to buy forgiveness, but because I deserved something without strings. I didn't deposit it for a week. Then I did. I used it to start something new. A year after the crash, my crash, I launched a digital platform for people navigating family trauma and toxic dynamics. Stories, resources, expert interviews, community forums. Not therapy, not advice, just connection. Just proof that others existed who knew the weight of being the strong one, the stable one, the forgotten one. It grew fast. Faster than I expected. One day, I got a message from someone with a last name I recognized. Rachel. The girl Jake had dated, the one who'd once practically lived in my house without contributing a cent. She said she had stumbled across the platform and realized, too late, the full scope of what I'd been living through. She apologized. Not profusely, not performatively. Just honestly. I didn't write back. But I didn't delete it either. By that summer, the platform had its first in-person event, a retreat in the mountains for people recovering from family-induced burnout. It was quiet, restorative, filled with long walks and gentle conversations. I stood on a deck one evening, watching the sun drop behind the trees, and realized I hadn't thought about Jake in days. Not because I didn't care. But because I no longer carried his life like it was mine. That night, as I lay in bed in a rented cabin, my phone buzzed. A photo. From my mom. She and my dad were standing in front of a small community center, holding a donation plaque. It said, "In support of recovery, growth, and second chances." They had started volunteering at an addiction recovery outreach group. She said she made coffee and listened. My dad helped repair broken tables and taught basic computer skills. The message attached said, "We're trying to do better, even if it's not with you. You started something, Megan. We just want to carry it forward." I cried then. For the last time in that story. Because there it was, the conclusion I hadn't dared to want. Not perfection. Not fairy tale forgiveness. But change. Earned, slow, quiet change. Jake remained incarcerated. He wrote twice more. I answered once. He said he was painting again. That he was mentoring a younger inmate. That he missed being loud and adored. But that he was starting to find meaning in being useful instead. I hoped that was true. And me? I kept building. Not because I had to. Because I chose to. And that was the final twist in the story. That in the wreckage they left me in, I found not just strength, but direction. Not just survival, but purpose. That in losing the family I thought I needed, I made space for the one I could create on my own terms. The crash didn't ruin my life. It rewrote it. And I wouldn't trade the ending for anything.